What if the greatest threat to freedom, truth, and justice isn't hatred or evil, but stupidity? In this powerful and unsettling exploration of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's rarely discussed theory, we uncover a chilling insight into how ordinary people, without malicious intent, can become silent enablers of tyranny. Bonhoeffer's words pierce through time, offering a profound diagnosis of a moral blindness that thrives not on ignorance, but on the refusal to think. Through 5 key revelations, this script unpacks why stupidity is more dangerous than evil, how it is weaponized by oppressive systems, and what it truly means to resist it, not with intellect alone, but with courage and conscience. Prepare to question what you thought you knew about the world and about yourself. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German theologian, philosopher, and resistance fighter against the Nazi regime, left behind not only a legacy of spiritual courage, but also one of the most unsettling observations about society and human behavior in his prison writings: the notion that stupidity is more than a lack of intelligence. It is, in fact, a moral deficiency. Bonhoeffer's insight did not come from abstract speculation, but from witnessing firsthand how educated, sophisticated, and seemingly rational people became complicit in the horrors of fascism, not out of hatred alone, but through passive and willful ignorance. This form of ignorance, as Bonhoeffer noted, was not the simple absence of knowledge or critical thinking skills, but a conscious abandonment of responsibility to think ethically and independently. To understand this, it is crucial to separate the concept of stupidity from the idea of low intelligence. Intelligence is the capacity to learn, reason, and solve problems. But stupidity, in Bonhoeffer's usage, is a condition where a person has the ability to think, but chooses not to. It is a moral collapse of the will to reason. People who are stupid in this sense are not lacking cognitive abilities. Rather, they are unwilling to apply those abilities when confronted with social, political, or ethical dilemmas that require courage, nuance, and personal accountability. Such individuals may appear outwardly normal, participate in everyday functions, and even hold positions of influence. But internally, they have surrendered their moral compass to the currents of mass opinion or authoritarian authority. Bonhoeffer's view of stupidity as a moral failing becomes particularly disturbing when we consider how it manifests in the real world. In oppressive regimes, people often find it easier and safer to conform than to question. This conformity is not born out of a genuine agreement with the ideology in power, but from a desire to avoid conflict, persecution, or exclusion. In such an environment, thinking critically becomes a subversive act. The stupid person, in Bonhoeffer's framework, does not engage in this act. Not because they are incapable, but because they no longer see value in doing so. Their silence and inaction enable injustice and amplify falsehoods, making them collaborators in evil without ever lifting a finger. This understanding of stupidity places a heavy weight on the ethical responsibility of individuals within a society. It suggests that every person faces a moral choice to remain intellectually awake and morally accountable, or to abandon their agency in favor of ideological convenience. What makes this choice so chilling is that the consequences of collective moral passivity are often invisible until it is too late. Bonhoeffer did not accuse the stupid of mere error, he saw them as instruments of destruction, not by intent, but by default. Their refusal to challenge lies, to interrogate reality, or to bear witness to truth transforms them into obstacles to justice more formidable than the deliberately evil. Moreover, this form of stupidity becomes a barrier to dialogue. The stupid person, Bonhoeffer notes, cannot be persuaded with reason because they are not engaged in the process of reason at all. They exist within a shell of ideological slogans, simplistic narratives, and borrowed opinions, none of which they feel responsible for defending with logic or evidence. Attempts to challenge them often lead to frustration because one is not confronting a person in search of truth, but a person avoiding it. Bonhoeffer saw this as one of the most insidious dangers of a corrupted society, that people can become so desensitized, so morally detached, that they no longer even know they are asleep. This insight remains deeply relevant in the contemporary age, where mass media, social polarization, and algorithm-driven echo chambers create conditions ripe for the spread of this moral stupidity. People consume curated realities, align themselves with ideological tribes, and outsource their moral reasoning to influencers or authority figures, often without realizing they are doing so. In such a climate, the real threat is not always the loud, hateful actor, but the quiet majority who refuse to see, hear, or speak truth. Bonhoeffer's chilling warning echoes through history as a reminder that the downfall of civilization does not only come through the hands of evil, but also through the silence and blindness of the stupid. Dietrich Bonhoeffer observed, with great clarity, that stupidity is not an isolated individual phenomenon, but rather a collective social disease that takes root and spreads most virulently under certain conditions. According to his reflections from prison, stupidity does not arise merely from personal laziness or ignorance, but from a deeper psychological and sociological process wherein people relinquish their independent thought in favor of group allegiance. This relinquishment is not forced, it is subtly, and at times unconsciously, chosen. Usually when the burden of moral or intellectual responsibility becomes too great to carry. As this abandonment of reason grows, stupidity becomes contagious, self-perpetuating, and dangerously difficult to uproot from the social psyche. Bonhoeffer noticed that stupidity increases dramatically in times of political upheaval, authoritarian control, and widespread propaganda. During such times, individuals often trade their moral agency for a false sense of safety or belonging. The process begins when people become passive observers of reality instead of engaged participants in it. They stop asking questions. They begin to outsource their thinking to ideologies, authorities, or social groups that offer prepackaged opinions. The inner moral compass becomes silent as individuals become mouthpieces for collective dogma. This surrender is not always obvious. It can be cloaked in slogans, party loyalty, or even in the defense of so-called common sense. But underneath it all is the abdication of personal discernment. Stupidity, in this view, becomes a force that thrives in crowds. In isolation, A person may still be capable of critical thinking and moral courage, but within a group, especially one driven by fear, anger, or conformity, the individual dissolves into the collective mindset. Bonhoeffer feared not only the rise of evil leaders, but the masses who followed them mindlessly. These were often not malevolent people, but ordinary citizens who stopped thinking for themselves and allowed others to think on their behalf. When ideas are no longer scrutinized and speech becomes an echo chamber of accepted lies, stupidity transforms into a cultural epidemic that justifies the unjust and legitimizes the absurd. What makes the spread of stupidity particularly insidious is that it often wears the mask of virtue. In oppressive societies, loyalty is praised above truth, silence is mistaken for peace, and obedience is called wisdom. Individuals who question dominant narratives are marginalized or ridiculed as troublemakers, while those who comply without thought are rewarded as stable citizens. In such an environment, intellectual laziness is incentivized. The structures of power feed this passivity, because a stupid population is far easier to control than a morally awake and critically minded one. Bonhoeffer saw how Nazi propaganda leveraged this passivity. The turning ordinary people into instruments of a monstrous system without them ever realizing the full extent of their complicity. Modern parallels can be seen in the way misinformation spreads through media, how algorithms reinforce biases, and how polarizing ideologies condition people to demonize opposing viewpoints without understanding them. In this context, stupidity becomes an epistemological and ethical failure. People no longer know what is true, because they no longer care to investigate it. They choose the comforting lie over the disruptive truth. They stop listening, not because they cannot hear, but because they no longer believe it matters. The danger is not only that stupidity spreads, but that it numbs the very faculties required to detect it. Bonhoeffer did not suggest that education alone could solve this problem. After all, some of the most educated people of his time were deeply complicit in Nazism. He pointed out that stupidity flourishes where people cease to be inwardly free, where they no longer see themselves as moral agents responsible for truth and justice. The conditions that allow stupidity to thrive are therefore moral, cultural, and deeply spiritual. It is in such climates that stupidity gains momentum, not as an individual flaw, but as a societal norm. And when society begins to accept unthinking compliance as the standard of good citizenship, the foundation of a just and human civilization begins to erode. Dietrich Bonhoeffer's writings reveal a sobering insight: stupidity, once it takes hold of a person or a society, is not simply a lack of intelligence, and thus cannot be defeated with logic or facts alone. This is perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of his theory. Reason, which is usually our strongest tool for addressing ignorance, becomes ineffective when confronting entrenched stupidity. The failure of reason in this context is not due to the weakness of rationality itself, but because stupidity resists reason not passively, but actively, by distorting, evading, or nullifying it altogether. Bonhoeffer explains that when a person becomes stupid in the moral philosophical sense, they lose the capacity to critically engage with reality. Instead of evaluating arguments, they absorb slogans. Instead of contemplating nuances, they cling to oversimplified binaries. Instead of asking, "Is this true?" they ask, "Is this acceptable to my group?" Any attempt to challenge them with facts or logical reasoning is either ignored or met with emotional defensiveness, ridicule, or outright aggression. What we encounter is not an absence of thought, but a rejection of the need to think. This makes meaningful dialogue almost impossible, as the foundations upon which communication is built, truth-seeking, openness, and respect for logic, are missing. This breakdown of reason is particularly visible in environments saturated with ideological fanaticism, propaganda, or tribal loyalty. In such environments, stupidity is reinforced by collective consensus. The individual no longer feels the burden to justify their beliefs through evidence or coherence, because the group affirms them regardless. In fact, the louder and more confident the group's chorus, the more suspicious they become of any dissenting voice, however rational it may be. Bonhoeffer describes this as a condition in which the stupid person is self-satisfied and not independent. They are not isolated. They are part of something bigger, which gives them the illusion of being correct. And it is precisely this illusion that immunizes them against any reasoning that contradicts the adopted narrative. Bonhoeffer's chilling insight lies in his assertion that stupidity is not conquered through teaching or debate. You cannot argue someone out of a state they did not reason themselves into. Attempts to do so often intensify their defensiveness, leading to entrenchment rather than reflection. The more you confront them with reason, the more they feel attacked. Not intellectually, but existentially. And so they retreat deeper into the safety of their collective beliefs. This reveals the moral and psychological dimensions of the problem stupidity. At its core is not just an intellectual failure, but a failure of character and courage. It is a refusal to think, disguised as certainty. In this light, the collapse of reason in the face of stupidity signals a deeper crisis of culture. When societies no longer value truth-seeking, when discomfort is avoided at all costs, and when emotional satisfaction is prioritized over intellectual rigor, stupidity becomes not only permissible, but normative. Bonhoeffer warns that the consequences of this are dire, because a population incapable of critical thinking is easily manipulated, controlled, and mobilized toward destructive ends. Tyrants do not require clever subjects, they require compliant ones. And stupidity, once normalized, creates the ideal conditions for evil to flourish with little resistance. This insight is not limited to Bonhoeffer's historical moment. Today, the failure of reason is evident in how misinformation spreads on social media, how populist rhetoric overrides policy, and how emotional outrage substitutes for thoughtful discussion. The architecture of digital life often amplifies stupidity by rewarding virality over veracity, spectacle over substance. In such an environment, those who speak truth with nuance are ignored, while those who shout comforting lies gain followers. This dynamic does not only weaken democracy, it erodes our shared capacity to distinguish between truth and illusion, fact and fiction, good and evil. Bonhoeffer's theory is thus spiritual warning as much as a philosophical diagnosis. The failure of reason against stupidity calls for more than intellectual tools. It demands moral renewal. People must be reawakened to the dignity of thinking for themselves, not simply to be clever, but to be ethically present in the world. When the will to understand is revived, when truth is honored again, even at the cost of popularity or comfort, then the spell of stupidity begins to break. In Bonhoeffer's perspective, one of the most chilling and profound revelations is that stupidity is not merely a personal failing, but a collective phenomenon. He argues that individuals, when isolated, may be capable of independent thought, critical self-reflection, and moral reasoning. However, once that individual is absorbed into a group, particularly one driven by ideology, propaganda, or emotional contagion, the ability to think for oneself diminishes drastically. What emerges is not just the silence of independent thought, but its substitution with pre-packaged opinions and slogans that the group deems acceptable. Bonhoeffer insists that stupidity gains power not through isolation, but through sociability. A person in a crowd often relinquishes responsibility for their thoughts and actions. They outsource their conscience to the collective, allowing the group to determine what is true, what is just, and what is acceptable. This dynamic transforms stupidity into a social contagion. It spreads not because of reasoned agreement, but because of conformity, emotional bonding, and the deep psychological need to belong. Individuals begin to echo each other's irrational beliefs, not because they understand them, but because their inclusion in the group depends on such affirmation. In this way, a stupidity becomes self-reinforcing and highly resistant to outside correction. This phenomenon is especially dangerous in mass societies, where people increasingly find themselves subjected to powerful influences, state propaganda, media manipulation, educational decay, and economic pressures that condition them to respond with obedience rather than reflection. In totalitarian regimes, Bonhoeffer observed how masses of seemingly normal individuals, many of whom were intelligent in the conventional sense, capitulated to morally absurd ideologies simply because the collective voice demanded it. In such an environment, the average person's moral compass is not destroyed, but silenced. Their stupidity is not rooted in ignorance, but in a willingness to let others think for them. Bonhoeffer's insights extend well beyond his own time. In the modern era, the digital world has accelerated the process he described. Social media platforms, algorithmic echo chambers, and the commodification of attention have intensified collective stupidity. Online, people rarely seek truth. Instead, they seek validation from those who think and feel like them. The feedback loop of likes, shares, and outrage incentives creates communities where absurd ideas thrive, not in spite of their irrationality, but because of it. In such communities, a questioning the dominant narrative becomes a betrayal, and reasoned dissent is dismissed as hostility. As a result, stupidity becomes not just tolerated but celebrated, especially when it aligns with group loyalty. This form of collective stupidity is difficult to confront because it wears the mask of consensus. When everyone around you shares the same irrational belief, the belief begins to feel like common sense. The individual who questions it appears deviant, dangerous, or even insane. This is why Bonhoeffer maintained that stupidity is more dangerous than malice. A malicious person may be confronted, persuaded, or disarmed through argument. But a stupid person, embedded within a collective delusion, cannot even hear the argument. Their mental defenses are not grounded in logic, but in group identity and emotional loyalty. They are no longer thinking, they are being thought. Bonhoeffer also warns that those who manipulate mass stupidity are often intelligent. The architects of tyranny, propaganda, and mass delusion understand that stupidity is a tool. It can be directed, shaped, and exploited. Such manipulators rely on the predictability of crowd behavior. They know that once stupidity takes root, the masses will defend their manipulators more fiercely than they would defend truth. This makes collective stupidity not merely a passive danger, but an active threat to justice, freedom, and moral sanity. It becomes a weapon wielded by the powerful and a shield used by the complicit. The terrifying implication of this analysis is that intelligence alone does not protect societies from descent into stupidity. What is required is moral courage, the willingness to stand alone, to think independently, and to suffer the consequences of dissent. Bonhoeffer lived and died by this principle, and his reflections challenge us to ask whether we, too, are capable of resisting the seduction of the crowd. The danger of collective stupidity lies not just in its capacity to make people blind, but in its ability to make them love their blindness because it feels safe, accepted, and righteous. Dietrich Bonhoeffer's theory does not merely identify stupidity as a psychological or social condition. It positions it as a profound moral and existential crisis. At its core, Bonhoeffer contends that stupidity, unlike ignorance, is a failure of responsibility and ethical accountability. An ignorant person lacks information. A stupid person refuses to engage in moral thought, even when the information is available. This refusal is not rooted in intellectual capacity, but in moral weakness. A surrender of one's inner voice to the external pressures of conformity, convenience, or fear. The consequences of such surrender are not merely intellectual. They are fundamentally ethical. Bonhoeffer distinguishes stupidity as an absence of self-reflective consciousness. The stupid person does not question, not because they cannot, but because they will not. This voluntary blindness carries with it a deep moral cost, the abdication of one's duty as a moral agent. In abandoning independent thought, one also relinquishes the capacity to choose good over evil in any meaningful way. The terrifying consequence of this is that a society filled with such individuals becomes fertile ground for injustice, cruelty, and oppression, not because people are malicious, but because they are indifferent to whether what they do is good or evil. They become instruments rather than individuals, tools rather than souls. In Bonhoeffer's view, this condition leads to what can be called existential diminishment. When a person chooses comfort, group loyalty, or ideological certainty over the uncomfortable work of moral reasoning, they begin to lose the very qualities that define human freedom and dignity. They cease to be authors of their own lives. Their thoughts are no longer their own, and their actions reflect the dictates of others. They live without truly living. This existential vacuum, though often masked by activity or political zeal, corrodes the foundations of society. It is not simply a passive state of not knowing, but an active betrayal of one's own conscience. This makes stupidity, in Bonhoeffer's diagnosis, far more dangerous than deliberate evil. Evil has a logic, it can be identified, opposed, punished. But stupidity defends itself through its very irrationality. When confronted with truth, the stupid person does not debate or inquire, but responds with denial, mockery, or aggression. The danger, therefore, lies not in argument, but in the impossibility of argument. This transforms the stupid person into a shield for tyranny. They do not challenge power but defend it, often without realizing they are doing so. In this way, stupidity becomes a tool for the destruction of truth, justice, and moral accountability. The moral implications of this are severe. In a society where stupidity is widespread, moral courage becomes both more necessary and more dangerous. Those who speak truth in such a society are not welcomed as reformers. They are treated as enemies. Their moral clarity threatens the comfort of collective blindness. Bonhoeffer himself experienced this reality under the Nazi regime, where many otherwise decent citizens supported monstrous policies simply because they refused to question the dominant narrative. In such a context, resistance becomes not only a political act, but a profoundly spiritual one. The reclamation of one's soul from the grip of collective delusion. Bonhoeffer's warning is that every individual is faced with a choice to think or to submit, to reflect or to conform, to bear the burden of conscience or to join the mob. These choices are not abstract but daily, embedded in how we speak, how we vote, how we treat others, and how we process what we hear and read. The moral weight of stupidity lies in its hidden nature. It often feels harmless, even virtuous, because it wears the mask of consensus, tradition, or loyalty. Yet beneath that mask is a quiet, relentless force that erodes justice, weakens resolve, and enables atrocities to unfold without resistance. Stupidity, then, is not merely a threat to truth or rationality. It is a spiritual ailment. It separates individuals from their own moral compass and alienates them from their responsibility to one another. Bonhoeffer's insight reminds us that human dignity is preserved not in brilliance, but in courage. The courage to think, to question, and to act when silence is more convenient. The terrifying nature of stupidity is that it asks nothing and demands nothing, and therefore costs everything. In light of Bonhoeffer's profound and unsettling analysis, we come to see that stupidity is not a harmless or merely humorous flaw, but a deeply embedded moral and social danger. It is not rooted in intellect, but in the abdication of responsibility, the loss of critical self-awareness, and the passive submission to ideological and collective forces. As explored throughout these keynotes, stupidity enables tyranny, silences truth, and disarms reason and extinguishes the courage to act. It disguises itself as obedience, tradition, or loyalty while undermining the very foundations of freedom, justice, and moral agency. Bonhoeffer's chilling warning compels us to recognize that the true struggle of our time is not only against overt evil, but against the silent spread of unthinking compliance. A crisis of character that threatens both the soul of the individual and the conscience of society.